I remember 17, 18 years ago, the first time I ever got exposed to philosophy and science around the debate of God's existence, I watched a guy, ardent atheist, Oxford professor, a guy named Anthony Flew. And he argued, he was in a debate against another Christian guy, William Lane Craig, and he debated him and made a mockery of Christianity. He said, theism's dumb, the belief in God is dumb. Don't you understand that for all these scientific reasons, for all these philosophical reasons, for all these psychological reasons, you shouldn't believe in God? Anthony Flew went hard on him, and I remember going, man, this guy is brilliant. I got to study this guy. I got to figure out what he believes. A bunch of years later, just before he passed away a few years ago, he actually wrote a book saying there is a God. That was actually the name of the book, There Is a God. And he retired his atheism. And he actually said this: atheism is no longer a logical, tenable, or defensible position to hold. Right? And it's because the deeper he went into the data and the philosophy and the science of it, he began to realize that it pointed toward the existence of God, not away from the existence of God. And he said, listen, the problem is, here's the position you and I are all in. We have to follow where the evidence leads, not where we want it to lead. So we might have written lots of books saying God doesn't exist and lectured around the world and debated people for our whole lives, building an entire industry around the idea that God doesn't exist like Anthony Flew did. But at some point he said, I got to believe where the evidence points, not what I want to be true. Some of you say, I don't want there to be a God in the universe because that's an authority structure, whatever. Listen, you got to follow where the evidence actually leads you. And for some things in life, really when it comes to the question of God, we're doing a detective thing. It's forensics. It's trying to get into something that's already happened that we got to sift through evidence to figure out what's logical.
Okay, so here we are. We're in week 3 of Challenges to Christianity, using this amazing book called the Bible, made up of 66 books, and this award-winning apologetics book, The Problem of God by Mark Clark, a pastor in our sister church, Village Church down south, a part of the Fellowship of Evangelical Baptist Churches. Author, pastor, he kind of looked at all sorts of evidence, scientific evidence, biology, philosophy, historic evidence, and he culminated into pretty good book to read and to find out, as well as if you have friends that are skeptical. If you're skeptical, grab them a copy for sure. Now, this is week 3. The first week was pretty foundational. We kind of did an overhaul of what we're going to be doing. If you didn't hear that, if you didn't see that, you can still catch that at mountainviewwhitehorse.ca/listen-online, or you can go to our YouTube channel, Facebook page, whatever, and you can make sure you catch that. Last week was our second week, and we looked at the problem of science, looking at the scientific evidence and discussing the big question that people have, that Christianity, so many believe that Christianity and science are opposed. Well, they're actually not, and they never have been. And talking about the idea of Big Bang, it's a theory, but why do people accept it as true? So we looked really at some scientific evidence of God's existence, looking at science and Christianity. And so if you missed that, you can still check that out, same place as before. Today, we're kind of moving into a little bit of philosophy, the philosophical questions. Why do we have reason compared to the rest of the animal kingdom? Okay, if we're just animals that have evolved, why do we have reason? And more importantly, why do we have morality? These are huge questions that human beings have, and skeptics, atheist skeptics of Christianity would say, oh, well, we just evolved to have morality and reason and things like that. It's really difficult. And so today we're asking these questions. We're going to dig into the philosophy of it and really see whether or not Christianity really provides some hopeful and truthful answers, and looking at our own minds. And we're going to go on a little bit of a head trip today, look inside our own brains and why we think the way we do, why we sort out information the way we do, why do we not just automatically go to whatever pleases us, whatever we want to do, what's the difference between feeling and thinking, all this stuff, looking into our own mind and answering some of those questions. And so let's jump right in. Let's look at some philosophy. So why do we have reason? This is the first question we need to capture. And for us, why do we think the way we do? The atheist perspective is that we created God in faith, that this is an evolutionary crutch, that when a species evolves to a certain point, they believe eventually we start creating God in faith and belief, and this is the evolutionary progression. This is what they believe. Here's the philosophical problem with that belief, is that if that's true, atheism could also be an evolutionary crutch. And so there's a big philosophical question out there in the world that's been really contemplated for hundreds of years now. And it's this: if our brain has evolved to survive and capitalize over the natural world, can we trust our brain to tell us the truth about who we are and where we come from? Okay, did we catch that? Some of you are kind of glassed over. Okay, did I catch that question? If our brain has evolved to survive and capitalize over the natural world, can we trust our brain to tell us the truth about who we are or where we come from? And just so we're clear, this isn't Christians asking this question. This has been a question discussed by atheists, theists, polytheists, that it's been a massive, massive question. I want to introduce you to someone. I want to introduce you to JBS Haldane. He's a geneticist, evolutionary biologist, and atheist. Okay? Real, one of the key minds in the past 100 years as far as atheism and evolutionary theory goes. And he struggled with this question as well. And so he published a statement that says, "It seems to me immensely unlikely that mind is a mere byproduct of matter." Pause there for a moment. Remember last week we looked at there's matter, and then matter turned into a big bang, and then eventually down the chain, human minds. Okay? So this is an atheist, and he's really struggling with that. So he says it's immensely unlikely that mind is a mere byproduct of matter. For if my mental processes are determined wholly by the motions of atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true. They may be sound chemically, but that does not make them sound logically. And here's the key. And hence, I have no reason for supposing my brain to be composed of atoms. Do we follow that? So as he gets into the philosophical question, he's like, well, wait a second, how do I know my brain's made of atoms? Is my own brain created the concept of atoms just so I can justify that my own position and my own mental process is just atoms bouncing around? Okay? So this is a guy who's gone down the rabbit hole and now he's lost. Okay? But here's the thing. He's not the only one. Even the father of modern atheism had his doubts. Charles Darwin. Almost everyone has heard of Charles Darwin. The bumper sticker rebellion to Christianity and theism is usually the little fish with the little legs that says Darwin. I've seen them loads. You probably have as well. So this guy is kind of the father of modern atheism. It kind of really propelled and got popular after him. Naturalist, geologist, biologist, and atheist. But here's something that this has been come to be known as Darwin's doubt. The year before he died, he started really contemplating this philosophical questions about whether he can trust an evolved mind. And here's what he said. He wrote to a colleague, William Graham. Again, at the time, this was private correspondence. Darwin had no idea that after he died, everything would become public record, and then we get the internet, and now everyone can know what he was thinking. But this is the reality. Private correspondence to a colleague, William Graham, 1 year before he died. He said this: "But then with me, the horrid doubt always arises, whether the convictions of a man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind, if there were any convictions in such a mind?" So again, in the last couple of years we find of Darwin's life, everything he stated his whole career is belief that there's a whole faith system that came from him, that in the last years of his life, the philosophical question of whether or not he can trust his own mind to be telling him the truth, this plagued him, and has plagued many atheists, many scientists, biologists. It's the philosophy that causes us to go back to the scientific evidence and say, okay, maybe, what if? Another private correspondence. In 1879, a few years before Darwin passed away, many people don't know, but he actually had a close friend that was an Anglican minister for a lot of years. They had a 30, 40-year relationship. And Reverend John B. Innes, and he was an Anglican minister, originally from Scotland. And again, in private correspondence to the Anglican minister, to his friend John, he said this: I have never been an atheist in the sense of denying the existence of God. I think that generally, an agnostic would be the most correct description of my state of mind. And where that comes from is really what he's talking about, the state of his mind. When he gets lost down the rabbit hole of his own thinking and his own mind, he's struggling. Even though he's the father of modern atheism and that there should be no God, here he is in the last few years of his life, and he said, you know what, I guess I'm going to have to call myself an agnostic. I can't really be an atheist because I can't trust the thoughts of my own mind to be correct, that they simply evolved. That he has reason, that he has self-awareness, that he has consciousness, that he has reason and the ability to think for himself and solve problems and him within his own world. That concept, he's struggling with the fact that that just evolved. Or his stated fact that just evolved. Darwin struggled with that. And it's continued to be a struggle. This is why in the chapter, The Problem of God's Existence, Mark Clark writes this. He says, mind had to exist before matter, which is the opposite of what atheism teaches. Matter led to mind and consciousness, it says. But on point with exactly what Jesus taught us about God. God is spirit, he said, John 4:24. If you don't want to believe the evidence, the onus is on you for proving God's non-existence, which is not as easy as it seems. When we reject the existence of God, we create more problems than we solve. But then we get to a deeper question. Why do we have morality? So atheism, the non-existence, maybe you guys have heard the term. Has everyone heard the term survival of the fittest? Has anyone heard that term before? All right, so that really started in Darwinian theory. That's the concept. And now the more technical name is called natural selection. Okay? Natural selection, survival of the fittest, is the process whereby organisms better adapted to their environment tend to survive and produce more offspring. The theory of its action was first fully expounded by Charles Darwin and is now believed to be the main process that brings about evolution. So the concept here is that every living species does everything they can to survive, eat and drink, maybe kill too, and to procreate. That is the main goals for life, is to create and expand your species. That's the goal. Works great, except when you run into humans. Things change. And so we need to ask, why are humans different than animals? Why in the human world, in the human life, aren't we just eating and killing, maybe to eat, drinking and procreating? Why is that not our sole focus? Why is there more to life for us than eating, drinking, and procreating? What's the deal with that? What changed? What's in us that causes us to do more than that? We're in the Yukon, so let's look at a few examples using bears. All right? So we're going to look at grizzly procreation. Okay? Grizzly bear procreation. So, set the stage. You guys all got all eyes open. I said procreation and we're talking grizzly bears. Yeah, so here we are. There's a nice meadow. Okay? Talking about the birds and the bees here, folks. A nice meadow, and there's a sow grazing in the meadow. Out of the woods comes a boar grizzly, and he's like, hello. All right? She's disinterested. But the boar's interested. If the boar runs out of the forest into the meadow and forcibly mates with the sow, we would simply say, hey, that's the circle of life. No one would ever interrupt the grizzly bear and say, excuse me, sir, there needs to be a little bit of commitment here before you make this move on this lady. Where's the ring, Mr. Grizz? What about love and commitment? No one's going to do that. We would never expect that. We'd never expect that from any part of the animal kingdom. We would simply probably film it and get David Attenborough to narrate, right? The bull sees his prize. And we would put it on a documentary and we would show it in public schools as educational. Why? Because let's flip this. If there was any human male, same meadow, a gal's picking flowers, and a guy runs out of the woods and tries to have his way with her, we would do anything and everything to stop it because it's rape. We would even, most of us, would risk our own lives as we saw what was unfolding, run out of the woods ourselves, and do anything and everything we could to stop that from happening, to get in the way before it ever started. And many of us, most of us, even though there's a high potential that that perpetrator may inflict pain or agony on us, that there's something knit inside of us, there's a call that comes up that causes us to say, no, this is evil, this is wrong, I will risk my own life to prevent this from happening. How does that work with natural selection? Where'd that come from? Who knit that inside of us? Let's look at another example. Let's look at Black Death. Black Bear Death. Last week, CBC released some footage and some helicopter photos of a black bear that had killed another black bear, maybe younger, older, weaker black bear, and just, having a snack, and said, well, he's dead now, I might as well eat him. And so the black bear is simply eating. Nothing wrong with that, maybe there was no other options. The other black bear is maybe a little slower, a little older, take out the weaker species, it's fine. Though people were mortified at the scene, in the comments, it's the circle of life, folks. Natural selection, survival of the fittest. I got to tell you this quote. So when CBC interviewed Steve Michael, human wildlife conflict specialist. It's a thing. That career may be yours. Sounds exciting to me. Works for Banff National Park. And he said to the reporter, we know it's a dog-eat-dog world out there, but we're finding out it's a bear-eat-bear world too. Okay, so attaboy Steve, knock one out of the park. Maybe that's why he's in the lab and in the field most. I don't know. So it's a bear-eat-bear world too. Hey, it's a circle of life. Okay, I want to talk to Steve, and I want to say, Steve, maybe I'm hungry and there's a weaker of my species, and I simply like red meat and I just take him out, start having a snack. Steve, when CBC comes around, are you going to say, we know it's a dog-eat-dog world out there. Well, it's also a human-eat-human world too. I don't think so, Steve. I don't think Steve's going to say that. Why? Why is killing and cannibalizing another human so wrong in the human world, and yet it's life in the animal world? What, like rape, murder, cannibalism, what is us? Any culture, you're looking across the world in languages that forcibly procreating or murdering and eating someone else, that these things are knit inside of us, that something cries out that this is wrong. You see, a lack of God's existence just does not have good answers for those questions. In fact, they have none. And if you ever see debates with someone who fully rejects God's existence, those are the questions that they just have to say, we don't have an answer. They say, well, somehow we evolved that way, and other species will eventually evolve there too. Are you sure? Are you sure there's not something different about humans? Are you sure that maybe there's something about us, something knit into our DNA that causes us to think a little bit differently? Are you sure doesn't the evidence point to the fact that maybe we're different? Maybe. Well, the Bible has answers. The Bible has answers for reason and morality. Why do we have consciousness, self-awareness, and reason? Why do we have a conscience, conviction, guilt, and morality? Those answers aren't often found very easily in the evolutionary science world, but in the Bible, there's great answers. Really logical answers. I want to introduce you, once again, we talked about it. I want to introduce you to the Apostle Paul. Apostle Paul, he was formerly Saul of Tarsus, and which is modern-day Turkey, and he was a Jewish Pharisee. He was kind of one of the top dogs in the Jewish world. He knew the Old Testament scriptures. He knew that world, but he was also a Roman citizen. And because being from modern-day Turkey and the Roman Empire, conquering places, he was well adjusted to both the Jewish world, the foreign world, the Greco-Roman world, and citizens of both, and he could kind of go where he wanted. And this, as well as being very intelligent and in theology and philosophy and history in his day, he was a very intelligent man. But in his mid-30s, he had a miraculous conversion to Christianity. And that propelled him to become one of the greatest missionaries and public speakers for the concept of Christianity all over the world. He traveled all over the modern world, and everywhere there was an amphitheater, the Apostle Paul would speak and people would listen. And he would talk to them on why Christianity, why Jesus Christ is the most hopeful and truthful faith position out there. And many people believed, and a lot of us, depending on where our roots come from, but most of us stem all the way back to Paul's missionary work. It's quite amazing. And so in 58 AD, he wrote to Rome. Now, Rome at the time, if we can remember this, as far as first century goes, it is the hub for anything and everything as far as learning. Science, mathematics, philosophy, theology. Rome is the hub. This is where the emperor was, and this, in the first century, it is the place. And so when he writes to Rome, it's important. And the letter of Romans that we have in our Bible, one of the books of the Bible, you can turn there now, he wrote some very important stuff, understanding that the people that are going to read this are like many of us. They don't have a deep understanding in the Old Testament and in the Jewish scriptures. There might be some, but there might be others that he's writing to that don't. And so he's trying to explain this concept. Well, how does the Gentile world, which is the non-Jewish world, how do they relate to this? How do they relate to Jesus? And so let's look first at Romans 2, 14 to 16. Romans 2, 14 to 16, Paul writes this. He says, for when Gentiles, non-Jews, who do not have the law, speaking of the first 5 books of the Bible, again, first 5 books of the Bible is our account for creation, worldwide flood, some important things as far as morality and law and how we live, the do's and do nots. They're in the first 5 books of the Bible. This is what Paul's talking about. The Gentile world, they don't have the law. They don't have the authoritative account for creation, worldwide flood, the law, all that stuff. Genealogies, they do not have that. Okay? So it's important to know. It's the first 5 books of the Bible. Okay? So, for when Gentiles who do not have the law, by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness. And their conflicting thoughts accuse or even accuse them on that day when, according to my gospel, God judges the secrets of men by Jesus Christ. Paul's explaining here that even though the Gentile world, as he travels around in the Greco-Roman world, all these different cultures, even though they do not have the first 5 books of the Bible, almost every culture has an account for creation. Many of them have an account for a worldwide flood. Moreover, they have an account for a moral code or a law, that there is knit within inside of them something that causes them these big things we talked about, rape, murder, cannibalism, these terrible, atrocious things, that inside of them cries out, even though they do not have the law, something inside of them cries to a moral law. It's established inside of them. It's knit there. And Paul's saying it was written in there. It's like coded in their DNA. We talked about the 3.1 billion letters of code last week in the human genome. Okay? This is like a light version of that it's written in their code. So let's look at this. Let's look at Romans 7 now. Flip over to Romans 7. Okay, Romans 7 through 8, he unpacks this a little bit more. Here he says, Romans 7:21. So I find it to be a law that when I want to do right, evil lies close at hand. Okay, a law, conscious, morality, conviction. Paul wants to do what's right, but there's an evil inside of him. What's the deal with that? There's an evil inside every human being. So what he's talking about. For I delight in the law of God in my inner being. But I see in my members, and by members he means body parts. That's the translation there. So hands, feet, mouth, ears, eyes. Okay? I see in my members, or my body parts, another law waging war against the law of my mind, and making me captive to the law of sin that dwells in my members, or my body parts. He wants to do what's right, but his hands, his feet, his eyes, his mouth, his ears, they are attracted to sin or evil. There's a war waging inside of them. Okay? And he says this, he says, wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then I myself serve the law of God with my mind, but with my flesh I serve the law of sin. The battle wages. But then he says this, there is therefore no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. For the law of the Spirit of life has set you free in Christ Jesus from the law of sin and death. For God has done what the law, weakened by the flesh, could not do, by sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh and for sin. He condemned sin in the flesh in order that the righteous requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us, who walk not according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. Here's what he's saying is, the battle in every human being will wage, that inside their conscience, inside they know what they need to do is right, and yet these body parts that we have long for evil things. We want to do things that are hatred. We want to go places that are covetous. We want to look at things that are lustful. We want to taste things that are gluttonous. Our body parts cry out for evil things, and yet our minds inside know we need to live better. But Paul says this is why Jesus had to come. This is why Jesus Christ, knowing that humans are weak, that Jesus would come in the likeness of a human being, looking like he would have every evil desire that any man has, and yet he was perfect. A man on this planet that's mind and actions, minds and body parts were equally and fully holy. And yet even though he was holy, he would go to the cross and he would die for all the evil things, all the sinful battle that takes place in every single human being, so that in that death and that sacrifice, and then his resurrection, beating the sin and death, every human being that declares him as Lord, every human being, though the battle wages between the law of our minds and the law of the flesh, that though it wages, the law of flesh has no power. That when we die and we go see the one who placed this reason and morality in our minds, that when we go see this Creator, he sees us like Jesus. In full, perfect unity. That our flesh no longer battles against our mind, that we're holy, holy, perfect, worthy because of Jesus.